All right. So thanks everyone for joining today. So like I mentioned earlier, my name is Martin Kepa. I'm VP of Account Management at Medcurrent. And Medcurrent, we're a physician-founded clinical decision support software company. So we were founded back in 2013 by Dr. Stephen Herman. He's a thoracic radiologist in Toronto, Canada, and we've been focusing on developing best-of-breed clinical decision support for radiology solutions ever since. So in terms of what our actual software does, so it's really there's a lot of different definitions of CDS, but from our perspective, CDS is really a solution that provides clinicians with real-time evidence-based guidelines directly at the point of care or at the point of order entry. And really, we do that sort of twofold. One is through the actual software itself. So we've developed a cloud-based, Microsoft Azure cloud-based platform that basically aligns to all privacy and security requirements. But being a cloud-based platform really allows us to kind of have a really efficient deployment and support model behind it. And the software itself is really composed of three modules. One is the actual end user module that integrates directly with the order comms and with the EPR systems, which I'll show you during the demo. There's also an analytics module, which basically allows you to get additional insights into the use of CDS. Basically, the idea being is that by being able to measure the efficacy or the use of CDS, you're able to enact further improvements and changes, or at least measure how CDS is impacting the trust or the network. And then the third part is what we call Authoring Studio, which is basically a module that allows you to curate and author any additional guidelines. So in addition to the actual software itself, we've also partnered with the Royal College of Radiologists and have implemented or incorporated the iRefer guidelines that they've been developing since 1989. And just for a little bit of background, probably most of you are aware, the RCR has been developing these iRefer referral guidelines for over 25 years. To date, there are about 300 or so evidence-based guidelines that we've incorporated. And having that partnership directly with the RCR allows us to really get access to the latest and greatest guidelines. The RCR has recently kind of changed their approach. So, previously the guidelines were being reviewed usually annually, and they've recently changed the process where it's more of an iterative, ongoing type of review process and update process. And being part of that kind of partnership with the RCR, we have first access to those guidelines. So I think one of the questions in your email, Dan, was around the frequency or the process. So the way it works right now is whenever the RCR makes any changes or updates to those guidelines, we would receive via an API that they've recently developed access to those guidelines to be able to pull the latest guidelines. We pull them into our test environments, review them against the previous mappings that have been done for a specific organization. We'd review that with the local trust or with the local clinical stakeholders to ensure that they're accurate and aligned to how the mapping has been performed between local procedures and the guidelines. And then we would only push those into your production environment after we kind of have internal reviews and approvals. So it is a very much a process that ensures that there's a second set of eyes to ensure that there's no missed guidelines or no missed mappings. But again, the process is continuous and it's ongoing. And again, being a cloud-based solution, there is no downtime or anything like that required from an end user perspective. It's all seamless once we actually push them out into the production environment. Okay, so with that, unless there are any kind of specific questions, I'll just get into an actual demo to show you what this looks like in a typical deployment with Clinisys ICE. And in terms of the actual integrations, we have built out about 17 different integrations to date. So we've started with large integrations with large EPRs like Cerner, Epic, Allscripts, but the vast majority of our current integrations within England are with Clinisys ICE as being kind of the primary order comm system that's available throughout England. We've been working with Clinisys for about 4 years now, so have a really strong partnership with them as well, and are continuously evolving the integration and adding additional functionality, which I'll show you during the demo. Okay, so here we go. So I'll bring up a typical ICE instance just to kind of show you what this looks like. So for those of you who use ICE or are familiar with ICE, this is the order entry module within ICE. We integrate directly at this point. So the idea with our solution is that we want to ensure that there's a real seamless bidirectional integration between the local order comm or EPR system and iRefer CDS. So again, we've spent a lot of time and effort to ensure that we have a really seamless end user experience, but again, a user experience that's driven by the EPR or the order comms. So I think one of the questions was around what are the triggers for launching iRefer CDS? And really, there's kind of two modes that we have right now that we've kind of seen in practice or that our customers have implemented. One is to actually implement directly as a clinician, as a referring clinician is selecting a test directly within the order comms. So in this particular case, I'll kind of go through a scenario where I'm going to launch CDS after selecting an MRI head, and then evaluate that MRI head through CDS to ensure that's the most appropriate exam. Or the other option is to actually launch it via a separate button that we can embed within ICE called Decision Support. So the idea here is that instead of launching it automatically, we can configure it so that we have a button and the user would have to select the button first before it actually launches. Obviously, there's pros and cons to both approaches. With the typical integration where we launch it directly by selecting the order within the order comm, it's seamless. So again, it launches for every single user that's logged into ICE. Whereas the other option is it's selective, so only launches upon clicking it. So again, depending on your specific workflow and requirements, we can configure the system either way. I think one of the advantages that we have from our end is that we're highly configurable. So we basically have a solution that is able to be kind of configured or customized based on local workflow and local requirements. And I'll get into some more details later. But what we found in practice is that no two trusts are exactly the same in terms of workflow. So we work very closely with our local stakeholders to ensure that we can configure the solution in a way that will actually work best for your organization. And in addition to that, we can evolve the configurations over time. So we might have a situation where we start, for example, launching CDS for, pardon me, for only a certain group of clinicians. For example, we can capture the user context, for example, for GPs or certain types of users. And the system can be configured to only launch for those specific users, or we can have a global configuration where it launches for everyone. So again, there's a lot of configuration options that are available, and again, we can go into more details during the demo. But what I'll do here is I'll just kind of launch this from an actual test. So in this case, within an ICE, I selected MRI tab, and I'm going to select an MRI head just as an example. So upon clicking MRI head, you'll notice what's going to happen is you're going to get a separate window that pops up on top of your ICE instance. This is going to be a modal window that's basically going to sit on top temporarily on top of your ICE instance. And like I mentioned earlier, this is a cloud-based solution. So again, there's no local software that needs to be installed on the desktop or anything like that. This is just being launched by an API call from ICE that launches this browser window and basically presents to the user. So again, from an ongoing support perspective, from an IT perspective, there's really no requirement aside from having the latest browsers. And again, we support Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox. Also support IE11 because I know some organizations are still using IE11. Obviously, it's kind of run out of support, but nonetheless, it is still compatible if that's still something that you have to use. But the idea here is that once we launch iRefer CDS, you'll notice a couple things. One, first and foremost, is that we pull specific information from ICE and pre-populate that in our iRefer CDS window. So, for example, the age and gender of the patient are pulled in automatically. And that's important because some of the guidelines or some of the pathways are age specific, some are gender specific. We don't want to have like pediatric pathways presented for adults and vice versa, or female guidelines for males. So it's important to pull this information so that we can refine the list of clinical indications and make it as relevant and simple as possible for the end user. The second part, you'll notice we pulled in that MRI head from ICE. And that's important because we do a clinical mapping, or our team, as part of our professional services, performs a clinical mapping between your local procedure catalog and ICE and the clinical indications. And the idea being is that we want to present clinically relevant clinical indications on this initial list that's presented to the clinician. Obviously, in this case, we're ordering our MRI head, so you'll see that some of these are like headaches and subarachnoid hemorrhages and strokes. So again, related to the head body part. But again, if I'm not seeing my clinical indication on this initial list, what you can do is you can type in a keyword, and the system will actually find some additional synonyms, and we'll find some additional information that might be related. So the idea being is that we want to present the most relevant first, but again, you can always type in manually any keywords, and it'll actually find a broader list. And in terms of this list itself, we have implemented a machine learning algorithm that basically learns the ordering behavior of the individual clinician or the user group. So behind the scenes, we're actually capturing through the interface the actual user ID from ICE. So again, what happens is over time, the system will build a sort of a reference of the types of procedures or clinical indications that user has been selecting, and then this list will dynamically readjust itself over time. So that, for example, if I'm a physician and I'm always ordering or consistently ordering, let's say, an acute stroke, this acute stroke will move to the top of the list to make it even easier to pick up that indication on a go-forward basis. So again, there's this algorithm that runs in the background and will dynamically readjust this list as you use the system more and more. And that's been implemented with the vast majority of our customers, and they really appreciate the fact that they can have that sort of personalization at the individual user level as they're using the system. And I'm just going to take a break right there. Any specific questions so far, or any comments up to this point?
No, thanks for showing it to us so far, Martin. It looks like a really nice actual improvement to the requesting flow of ICE itself, really. It's almost a nice UI layer on top of ICE that adapts to the referrer's needs and adds a bit of intelligence to it on things like gender and age, as you've said. And I imagine there's probably some other rules you could build in if you've got sufficient metadata supply at that point.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good segue into this patient info panel. So in addition to some patient level information, demographic info, we can also pull in certain lab values or clinical problems. So in this case, with ICE, we're able to pull in the patient's latest eGFR and D-dimer results, and obviously that's important for assessing renal impairment and potentially contraindications for contrast-based imaging. So by being able to pull that in directly, and again, we can apply business rules and logic to show, the most recent prior or, have some sort of range. So again, that's configurable. But the idea being is that we can pull that information and potentially use it to then not display or gray out certain types of recommendations. So for example, let's say the patient had a eGFR of, let's say, 25 mils per minute, which would indicate a renal impairment. As I'm going through the rest of the pathway, the system would actually know potentially not to recommend a contrast-based test, let's say a CT with contrast or something like that. It would actually gray it out or give you a warning indicating that the patient is potentially compromised from a kidney function perspective, and actually would prompt the user to select a reason why they're choosing to override that. So again, we're able to, by pulling in this data, we're able to use that data to further, provide additional, workflow efficiencies, as well as potentially a patient safety aspect as well.
So Martin, I mean, it's actually that's actually a task that people do in a lot of hospitals. They have somebody in CT whose job for the morning is checking things like the eGFRs. So are you saying that this could potentially replace some of those tasks because it's taking it straight from the lab feed for you and actually not even letting them get to the point of request if it doesn't meet specific criteria that you've set?
That's correct. Yeah. So again, we're pulling that directly from the latest result from ICE. So as long as that eGFR was sent over to ICE, we're able to pull it from ICE. And again, we can apply business rules to actually, block the workflow, or at least provide a warning within the workflow so that the user can make a more informed decision. So again, it's totally up to you how you want to implement it. But the idea being is, yes, we definitely pull that information and use it for, within the system.
I think Gary has a question. He needs to unmute if he wants to ask it.
Yeah, I've got two related questions that come back to that. So obviously that could eradicate the need for a test, for a piece of work in a department. But if, say, 50% of users have selected to not auto launch and use the system, are we able to see whether or not the referral has used it? Because if we can't, we'd still have to check them all potentially. Are we able to use business intelligence to understand which ones have sort of met this criteria or not? Do you understand? Yeah. Does that question make sense? Right.
Yeah, well, I think we capture all these lab values are captured in our analytics, and every single procedure that goes through the system, we actually capture any kind of relevant background information that's sent from the system. And again, maybe once I get to the end of the workflow, I'll actually kind of display this information. But yeah, I mean, the idea being is that we can capture this information, use it, report on it, and it's all tracked in our analytics. In addition to that, we can also capture it in a distinct field in analytics, and you can do some additional reporting as well using your own tool. So again, we haven't had that kind of request up to this point where kind of going to that degree, but the data is available if you do want to kind of
yeah, because I was just thinking if we'd potentially have to have an operational procedure where everyone uses it so that you didn't need to do that, or we need to be able to separate them out. Thank you. So I didn't want to interrupt your flow at the time, and I might have missed it, but when you showed us the auto launch tick box, is that an individual choice, or can we do that at a sort of system super user level? So can we turn on auto launch as an operational thing from a trust perspective, or is it down to each individual? How can that be used?
Yeah, I think the way, because again, it's Clinisys that's actually launching the API. Yeah. And my understanding is that they can configure it at a user role, right? So for example, if some users are GPs and other users are surgeons or whatever, they're able to control it at that point, at that role level. So I don't think it's individual, but definitely at the role.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions. Thank you. And Aidan, if you want to come in now.
You covered at least one of my questions, Gary. I guess, Martin, for your benefit, I'd probably come in at this more from a informatics IT perspective and how this is integrated. So if we're going to come on to that, I can come back to my questions at the end if it's more appropriate. Just let me know. I'm just intrigued to understand. It looks like the auto launch through ICE will obviously have a minimum requirement in terms of ICE versions that trusts are running on. And my assumption is to introduce this CDS piece, we would also have to do some actual ICE level testing and version upgrade potentially as well. I'm just trying to understand how the two link together technically.
Yeah. So to answer your question, yeah. So there is a minimum required version of ICE, and that's 7.1.5, and that kind of includes the latest integration into iRefer CDS. Now, having said that, because of the sunsetting of IE11 that happened back in June, Clinisys is moving all customers to version 7.1.7, I think, or something, or 7.1.8, something like that. So they're actually in the process right now of just converting everyone over to the kind of minimum supported version anyway. And what we've noticed, like last year we had, 34 projects last year that participated. Out of those 34, about 27, I think, were ICE based. And yeah, one of the kind of initial requirements was to upgrade the ICE in the test environments first. And again, we do all the testing. We have a full suite of test cases that's performed, and then obviously it's moved into production after that. Now, in terms of the ICE integration itself, so like I mentioned, we've been working with Clinisys now for about 4 years. So we've developed a custom integration directly with Clinisys and with the ICE version 7 framework. So again, it's a really well-established, really mature type of integration. And again, it's kind of the same type of integration that works for all the different ICE customers. So really, there isn't that much variation. I would say some of the key things are kind of more configuration based, like for example, which users tend to launch or which user groups tend to launch to determine whether you want to embed that direct button versus launching it from a procedure. So there's a couple of variations, but the actual data flow between systems, that's a really well-established type of integration, bidirectional integration that has been existing for multiple years now. Okay. But I can, after the call, I can kind of send you some additional information that goes into more technical details if you like.
Yeah, that'd be useful just for my interest, if that's okay, Martin. And just one final question, because I can see Jonathan's got his hand up. Obviously, it's doing an API call. Both you're doing an API call to pull new mappings through, if that's the right phrase, Martin. You mentioned you then test those and then deploy those out. Is that deployment of new mappings, or apologies if I'm using the wrong terms, is that automatically then visible in trusts without trusts testing that? Is it just something that's seamless to them? Right.
Well, what we do is we when we do that pull from the RCR, so the RCR has they just recently developed an API for this. So we pulled, using that get command or whatever it is, I can't remember now. We pull that in. We pull it into our authoring studio tool, which then basically has a configuration for each individual instance and trust, obviously. And again, that's kind of first pulled into the test environment, and it's all version controlled as well. And then we would kind of do a review, make sure that everything is still kind of matching up, all the mappings are correct. We would also do a kind of second pass if there's any kind of new guidelines or major changes to any guidelines. We'd review those with the actual local clinicians that are part of the project, just to ensure that there's alignment there. And only after having that consensus or agreement would we then kind of push it into the actual solution. And again, we would kind of first typically push it to the test environment, run through a couple of scenarios just to make sure everything's okay, and then only into production after that. But from an end user perspective, once we push it out, again, there's no downtime. It's seamless. Yeah, they wouldn't notice. It's just next time they access the tool, it's just there.
That's fine. Thank you. That makes sense.
John, if you want to.
Yeah. Hi, Martin. Thing I was wondering about, and it kind of sprung to mind when he talked about you reordering the preferred options that people would select. I'm kind of thinking here about the people referring that have the non-medical background and therefore have a limitation on what it is they can ask for. Is there anything built into the system that can sort of control that? Because that would be a really good way of preventing those requests even getting to us, and effectively people finding themselves in a bit of a hole in terms of exceeding their scope of practice and breaking IRMA regulations and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as you can see from the demo, like we launch directly from the ICE interface. So again, we're kind of controlled, or launching iRefer CDS is really controlled at the ICE level. So in your example with those users, I mean, would they already have access to ICE ordering, or would they not even have access to be able to order imaging within ICE?
They should be able to order within ICE, yeah.
Right. So so again, if they can order, they can then technically launch, iRefer CDS, because again, the API will get triggered. Now, having said that, what we've seen in practice is, for example, some of the trusts right now, they don't permit GPs to order, CTs or MRs, for example. So again, via configuration, what we can do is we can actually suppress providing any recommendations for CT and MR potentially. So we would basically gray out, we can still show it as a recommendation, but it would be kind of grayed out, and not, the user wouldn't be able to kind of click on it. So again, we can definitely control it that way. But again, it's wholly up to you how you actually want to allow different users and what sort of studies they want to order. I think the general idea with iRefer CDS is really to provide the best appropriate guidelines. And if that entails, doing a CT and MR, then, I think that's a conversation you need to have internally about potentially allowing GPs to order that, because it is kind of recommended. But again, as a sort of interim step, we can't suppress it. We can grade out until the right time, or until you feel from an organizational perspective that, you can open it up.
Great. Thank you. No, that's grand. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, what I'll do is I'll just kind of finish the workflow, because obviously it's a very good discussion, but I'll just wanted to kind of show you kind of the end result of the workflow. So again, in this particular question, so we captured the lab values, we can also capture certain, codes, imaging history if it exists, vitals. So there's a lot of other information that can be captured potentially. Now with ICE, we've kind of really seen only the lab values being kind of applicable, but with some of our other systems, we can capture some additional information. Again, it's totally configurable and it's supported on the interface. But in terms of the actual workflow, then as I get to the primary reason for imaging or clinical indications, you'll notice that all of these have an iRefer suffix at the end of them, meaning that there is a iRefer guideline that's associated with these specific clinical indications. If you had developed any local guidelines that we incorporated, you have like a local suffix, and you can have a combination of both iRefer and local guidelines kind of coexist at the same time. And again, that's something that's configured during our initial kind of project work, and we work closely with you to kind of present what's relevant. But in this case, just for the sake of the example, I'll click on subarachnoid hemorrhage. And then you notice that there are additional questions that arise. And that's important because obviously, depending on the nature of that subarachnoid hemorrhage, if it's suspected or proven, it might lead to a different recommendation or a different pathway. So again, these are now questions that have been developed by the RCR through the guidelines. Whenever there's any changes to these questions or update to these questions, we'd automatically have those updates incorporated here. But the idea being is that we want to now rely on the kind of body of evidence or on the guidelines that have been provided by the RCR in order to ask the user some additional questions before getting to the recommendation. And typically, we'll have 1 to 2 additional questions before we actually get to the final recommendation. So in this case, I'm going to say it's a suspected subarachnoid hemorrhage. So after selecting that, and I can always kind of go back and see what I selected. Basically, based on the iRefer guidelines and based on the suspected subarachnoid hemorrhage, the most appropriate test to perform would be to do a CT head, and that's going to denote in this green box over here. That basically denotes that this is kind of the most appropriate or the most indicated recommendation. We still have the actual requested procedure, the MR head, but you'll notice that it's under a specialized investigation in this kind of yellow box. And then the CT angios or MR angios are not indicated, and they're denoted in this red color. So again, trying to keep that traffic signal type of color scheme, green, yellow, red, to make it simpler for the clinicians to have a visual cue to be able to pick up the most appropriate versus the least appropriate. Now, having said that, with iRefer CDS, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to always choose the recommendation or the one that's green. We can still choose one that's in that kind of middle category. So the system will kind of, still allow you to do that. But what will happen is we can configure another pop-up box that will be presented to the user that will actually prompt them to provide a reason for not choosing the most appropriate indication. The idea being is that, there could be valid reasons, or, there could be some specific condition. So they need to persist with the MR head in this case. And we would just want to be able to capture the reason for that and be able to track that in the analytics so that we can do further reporting and investigation. But definitely, we don't have to necessarily force the user to choose, the most appropriate one. Having said that, we do have configurations, and again, we've kind of started to explore this with certain customers, where we can actually create what's called a hard stop, where it will actually force the user only to go with the most appropriate indication. Again, that's more kind of relevant, I would say, in the U.S. market, and we've kind of seen that in a couple of customers in the U.S. But in England right now, it's more of a soft stop, where we'll just prompt the user to enter some additional information before they persist with the procedure. But in addition to the actual kind of indication score, we also provide a relative radiation level indicator. So you can see here with the CT head, 2 out of the 4 radiation level icons are populated. If I click on that little question mark button, it gives me an actual IRMA regulation and the effective dose. So again, this is just another reference that's available to make a more informed decision as it relates to radiation exposure. We provide this summary called the device text. So just to give the clinician a 1 to 2 sentence summary of the actual recommendation or the guideline. In some cases, you'll see that there's some additional information provided or some additional context. But in addition to that, we also have this iRefer icon, where if I click on that, it will actually render a PDF version of the actual iRefer guidelines, and will actually give me the reference number, some additional clinical problems or red flags, some additional information around the different investigations and recommendations, as well as evidence, in this case, from NICE guidance, as well as some literature review. So again, the idea being is that we want to provide some additional information to the clinician if they have any additional questions around the recommendation, and it's all provided directly within the solution. And if there are any updates to this guideline, if the RCR releases any new guidance or any new changes to this guideline, we would automatically get that, and then it'd be available. So again, you always have the latest guideline, the latest approved guideline available to you within the solution, and you can always kind of reference it. And then at this point, again, just for the sake of this example, let's assume that I'm going to switch over to my CT head as the most appropriate. Once I click on that and click on Submit Request, it's going to automatically close down iRefer CDS and return you back to your ICE order comms. And you notice that we automatically updated from an MR head that we had initially requested to a CT head. And again, this is done at a system-to-system level. So again, there's no manual cancellation and recreation of an order by the clinician. This is all done from a system-to-system perspective. You know, we have a clinical mapping of codes between iRefer CDS and ICE. So we would automatically update that order to reflect what was actually selected by the clinician. And then at this point, the rest of the workflow would remain exactly the same. You know, the clinician can add some additional notes as they currently do, and you know, accept the request. And then if I kind of go back to my list within ICE, I can now see that this order had, you know, basically under the clinical detail screen, you know, we basically went through iRefer CDS. We had selected the subarachnoid hemorrhage that was suspected, and it was indicated. So we had chosen that green category, which basically was the recommended imaging test to perform. So again, we can map that all back to ICE. In this particular demo environment, it's all kind of put into one field. But if you have a distinct field in your ICE instance, then we can actually map it to distinct fields. And it all kind of depends on how you're currently set up. But again, the idea here is that we kind of, you know, interrupted the workflow, provided the guidance, and then returned back to your ICE workflow, and everything else would remain as is, with the difference now being is that you went through CDS and have evidence of that CDS encounter that's provided within ICE. And then obviously, as this order goes downstream to your risks, you know, you can capture that information as well. So again, I'll take a pause there again, and any kind of additional questions at this point?
No, I think that's a good end-to-end demo of the end user experience for me. I can see a few other people have questions, but I would also be keen to see what it's like to manage things like protocols, pathways, decision trees as an administrator.
Okay. I don't think this demo account has full access to the to be able to kind of author anything on the fly. So let me, I'll just kind of bring this up. Yeah, so this is what I'm showing right now is what's called our authoring studio. So this is really where we do all the configurations for the solution. So you can see, you know, we have a lot of different kind of configuration options. But what I'll show you right now is what's called our authoring studio, which is basically where we can manage the pathways and the guidelines. So I'll just bring up, let's say, the PE pathway. And again, it's all version controlled. And the idea here is also we have the concept of a content author and a content creator. So again, there's a systems of checks and balances to ensure that, you know, whoever kind of authors the guideline, there's a second set of eyes that will actually approve it to make sure that it's clinically accurate. And you can always kind of go back in version history to basically see how that guideline has evolved over time. And in terms of the interface, we kind of created this kind of almost like a BPMN type of notation where you drop in a specific clinical indication. In this case, this is the PE suspected pathway from the RCR. You can drop in additional questions, calculators, and ultimately leading to different scenarios. And you can make this as simple or as complicated as required. So in this particular case, one of the first questions that's asked is whether the patient's pregnant, yes or no. and depending on the response, it can take the user down a different pathway, and and kind of different recommendations. And you can really make this as simple or as complex as required. And what we've seen in practice is, often organizations have developed some local best practices or some local kind of variations, and they use this tool to be able to actually, create or author those pathways and be able to kind of manage those pathways on an ongoing basis. And typically what happens is, and let me just see, yeah, I don't think I have access to be able to do anything more advanced with my account, but basically, I mean, you can, when you define questions, you can define, certain types of logic. So you can create like Boolean logic, yes or no logic. You can create calculations. You can create, some multi-list, or like, if you want to select multiple red flags, like a bullet list, you can kind of have different types of options that are possible. Let me just see.
Yeah, it looks very configurable, the sort of decision tree logic approach.
Exactly.
I think Lynn has a question as well that I realize I jumped ahead.
Hi, Martin. I just have a really quick question for you. A lot of the clinicians may choose to try and fast track their orders through the system, and I wondered if there was any way of, once you've gone through the iRefer CDS and it's picked the exam code, whether it's actually possible for the priority to be set automatically by the system, so that if it's deemed to be more appropriate, it goes through the system as a fast track rather than a routine exam.
Yeah, very good question. So that's actually something that we're starting to test right now with some of our customers. So one thing we can actually set at the kind of recommendations is to set a certain priority code. And yeah, so this is just an example here, but you can see here this priority field. So we provide a score for the recommendation, the name of it, and then also a priority. Now in this example, it just has a low priority, but we can replace this with let's say a number, let's say between 1 and 4. And then once we send that downstream to ICE, we can send that priority code as well. And then basically that system would be able to kind of pick up that code and use it for whatever purposes are required. So yeah, we definitely can do it. And as you can see, we kind of already have a field for it. It's just a matter of now defining downstream how you actually pick up that priority code and how you actually use it within your RIS or whatever other system that's receiving this order.
That's really good. I mean, currently the referrer will choose that priority, which does map into Chris. So if we can link those two, I think that would be a really useful way of stopping everything becoming high priority. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, like to Dan's earlier point, like we really pride ourselves on being highly configurable because being like a clinician-founded company, we know that there's a lot of variation and a lot of different ways of practicing. So we really make it configuration driven. So we really try to make it so that we can have that flexibility and not lock you into a certain workflow. Really, kind of the idea being is that we want to have the solution adapt to your workflow and not the other way around. So again. Unfortunately, like my access in this environment doesn't have full access to the different fields, but again, you can see that even when I kind of click on some of these, it kind of shows you some of the configurations that are possible. And the other thing to note here is that we can also clone certain pathways, right? So rather than having to kind of re-author, let's say there's some kind of common pathway between multiple indications, rather than having to author each and every time, we can just clone it between one pathway into another and just drop it in so that it saves yourself a lot of time having to kind of start from scratch. So again, we built some kind of intelligence in there to be able to make this tool as kind of simple as possible to use and give you a lot, of robust functionality and save you a lot of time.
Can I ask you a question about the configuration? So some of us really like things that are very configurable because we'll enjoy, tweaking things and making that perfect pathway. But others don't like it. And when we're working at a network level, we would kind of like to try and do work once and then roll it out across a network. So are all of these pathways kind of exportable or mappable to different institutions? Yeah. And is there the concept of functioning as a network in iRefer?
Yep, excellent question. So, for example, one of our network customers from last year, MRAD, they're deploying this at 7 of their trusts. And what they decided to do is they took a look at this as a sort of network level project, and they're actually creating consistent pathways amongst all 7 trusts. So basically, the idea is that we're going to do mapping or kind of create this, authoring studio map that's going to be kind of consistently used throughout all the different trusts. And the way it would work is we'd kind of develop it once here in authoring studio, and then we can clone that to the separate instances. So again, from our perspective, we integrate directly with the local systems. So, it's a one-to-one integration between ICE and Medcurrent. But what we can do is once we create one of these mappings, we just clone it to the other instances, and then they would inherit it at that point at a network level. So again, that's kind of what MRAD is doing. But this is kind of the trend that we're seeing right now with networks, is that they're trying to have consistent pathways amongst all their different trusts or all the different referrals. And again, using this tool, you can very easily create it once and then replicate it or copy it to the other trusts that are part of that network.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what we have. I mean, you may know we have a range of special interest groups who are creating regional pathways, but actually the kind of implementation and enforcement, if you like, of them to make sure that we use them has always felt like the trickiest part of it. And it seems like controlling the request at the front door is the key to the rest of the pathway being triggered correctly for the right condition. So being able to use it at network level is a key feature for us. And I understand that there's a one-time opportunity at the moment to have this funded by some capital central funding. Is that likely to only be available? I've said it's one time. Is it likely to be available just once right now? Do organizations need to sort of express their interest soon if they want to use this?
Yeah, that's correct. So as part of the digital diagnostic capability program through NHS Digital, they, as of last year, they basically made a conscious decision to look into implementing iRefer CDS at a national level. And again, partially because of the recommendations from the GIRF report and the Sir Richards report. And then basically have a process where trusts apply through an LOA process. And I think, Gary, you might have some more details probably, but basically it's a 3-year capital funding stream where basically NHS will fund both the implementation and 3 years worth of licenses as part of a capital LOA request. And this would be kind of a capital request like you currently do for any other capital request with NHS, same sort of process. And basically, I think they're also focusing on trying to get more of a sort of network level type of deployment. So they're basically looking at kind of network level LOAs rather than individual trust LOAs, which was the case last year. So I can,
Martin, I feel like a key message that we have to say then is that if organizations don't choose to sort of make a decision and proceed as we're doing this in a network manner at the moment, but they saw it in action, liked it, and changed their minds in the future, it would actually become a self-funded venture at that point, rather than taking the opportunity that's available right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's it all depends on the trust, but I think the idea being is that
I'll just come in there. I mean, so it's a bit unfair to put that on Martin, but the funding is national funding. It's available in this year. We have submitted an LOA as a network. The funding is notionally approved. We need to move forward with the work. If a trust makes a decision not to do that, then obviously any future decision to then implement it because it was liked, you would need to find the funding in future by whatever means. So it's a one-time opportunity at this point in time. I can't say they won't be in the future, or they will be, but the money's been made available last year and this year.
And it's for 3 years. So let's fast forward to year 4, because I know that people who will watch this will wonder, well, what happens then? So what sort of process of continuing the service would take place leading into year 4?
Yeah, so we would have to renew just obviously the implementation that would have already been covered as part of the initial 3-year period. So we just continue with the licenses. And again, the way that we've licensed this is based on a volume tier model, where depending on your annual order volumes that are generated through that specific, Clinisys ICE instance that's going through CDS, you basically would be put in a different level or a different tier, licensing tier. And then basically, you could go and do like a annual subscription model at that point, year after year. And we would just sort of, reassess the volumes on an annual basis and then kind of put you in the right tier at that point. Or again, if you have additional capital funding available, then, we can do another kind of multi-year capital type of funding license. Yep. So it all kind of really depends on procurement. Now, right now we typically, or the only kind of path for procurement is through the G-Cloud framework. So again, it's a nationally approved procurement framework, and it's kind of been standardized by Crown Commercial Services, and we would kind of envision continuing to use that framework from a procurement perspective to make it simpler on local procurement teams.
So it's a volume-based tier pricing model, so what's the unit of counting to get to your volume? So when do you consider it like an invocation that you count as a credit?
Yeah, so it's basically the amount of orders that are processed through CDS. So for example, let's say you generate 100,000 orders and radiology orders that would have to go, or that would go through CDS, then we would count the 100,000 orders as being relevant. So typically one of the kind of decisions you have to make kind of early on is to evaluate which type of orders you actually want to have evaluated through CDS, like all modalities, certain modalities, so on and so forth. So that's kind of what we use as a starting point. But again, our analytics tool will count every single transaction that goes through the system, and then we'll kind of use that information to provide feedback in terms of number of orders that are going through, and then obviously the licensing tier.
So a transaction does not necessarily proceed all the way to a submitted request, does it, though?
That's great, yeah. So if the user cancels kind of the transaction midway through, then we wouldn't count that as a CDS request. Only once we generate an order and send it back to the system would that be considered an end-to-end transaction.
So actually it's quite measurable, because it's basically the same figure as, well, if you have it turned on for everything, it's the same figure as how many requests you receive. Obviously it might not, places might not use it for everything. Okay, I think you covered everything that I had lined up to ask you. Does anybody else have any final questions for Martin? No. Martin, we'll just say thank you for the demo you've given then.
Yeah, no, and really appreciate it. I know we kind of ran out of time. There's also the analytics module, which I'm not sure if you still want to kind of show that or not, but just wanted to mention that every single transaction that goes through the system is measured, and we basically are able to do some pretty advanced business intelligence and analytics on the data to be able to further identify kind of benefits and trends and patterns. And in fact, that's kind of what we use for any kind of reporting, or as part of the NHS funding requirements, is that you have to actually show some of the data, and that's the tool that we use to be able to actually show you the data. So I know we kind of don't have time to go into details, but I again just want to mention to everyone that we do have this kind of advanced BI and analytics capability built in right into the solution that you can access anytime and be able to run your own stats and reporting.
And it looks quite pretty as well. I think that's certainly something that if we're proceeding with the solution, that we'll get you back and try and do some more advanced demos of some of the modules of it. But I think this has served as a great overview for everybody. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.